Hi, and welcome to the Rare Business Podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm a consultant, advisor, researcher, and writer on all things related to customer service and customer experience. Through this podcast, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, and leading thinkers about what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees in this fast-moving modern age that we live in. If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then welcome, and please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 250 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then thank you for returning, and I'll aim to do a good enough job to keep you coming back week after week. Anyway, that's enough from me right now. Let's get into the interview. So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Karen Jaw-Madson, who is Principal of Co-Design of Work Experience and author of a new book, which we're going to talk about today. So, hi Karen, and welcome to the show.
Hi Adrian, thanks for having me.
So, Karen, before we get stuck into the book, as it were, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure. My parents immigrated from Taiwan. They immigrated to the East Coast of the U.S., and I was born there. And we moved around quite a bit growing up. And then I went to college in what they call the Seven Sisters schools. I went to a women's college, Bryn Mawr.
Okay.
And after that, I did move out to the West Coast, to California for the first time to do some work and to establish some residency toward a graduate program before I decided to go back to the East Coast to finish my graduate studies there at Columbia University. Mm-hmm. So I've done a lot of moving around. If I go look back, I think at one point I did count. I've lived in over 15 places in my life, and with my husband, we've moved 9 times.
Blimey.
Yeah. So we've lived overseas. We've lived in different regions of the U.S. We've gotten a good sense of all the different cultures and subcultures that are out there. Mm-hmm. And love to see. Europe was particularly fun for us. We lived in Ireland for a couple of years, and
nice.
It was just a wonderful launching point to all these other places in Europe through Ryanair, as you know.
Yes,
Aer Lingus. So, yeah, that's really, I've lived a life where I've gotten to see a lot of things, both personally and professionally. I've had international roles. I started out in nonprofit, moved to corporate, started out in program management, then university relations and diversity, and then grew up, so to speak, in the human resources functional area before I decided to make a big change 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, and work in this management consulting space around strategy, people, and culture.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So let's get straight into the subject of the interview, because you've just recently published a new book called Culture Your Culture, Innovating Experiences at Work. Now, first of all, I want to congratulate you on publishing the book, because I know how hard that is.
Yes, it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, indeed. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and who's it for and the main thesis and sort of how it came about?
Sure. The book was generated out of a frustration that we talk so much about culture and blame culture primarily for failures in businesses after the fact, and yet there was no step-by-step how-to for intentionally creating culture on the front end.
Right.
And we know there's plenty of evidence out there about what a great business asset or liability culture can be, and yet many people don't know how to successfully manage it, be intentional about it, change it. So that's really where the book came about. There was a gap there. There was an unmet need that I think needed to be filled, and so that's kind of where this book came about. Okay. It was out of that frustration. So there's no step-by-step how-to. There's a lot of, how I did it.
Yes.
So to speak.
Yeah.
But there's no framework, structure, or discipline around how to do that.
Okay.
And that's why this book was written. And it's really meant to be a contribution. It builds upon a lot of research and work that we know around people and workplaces. And it makes the connections and frames everything together into this methodology that hopefully makes a difference. Well, I know it works because I practice it.
Sure.
But there's so much more than what one person, one company can do. And so this was my contribution to share.
Perfect.
So that's kind of where this book came about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can get that, and that sort of really resonates with me, because I have seen lots of people talking about culture and talk about our culture and this and that and the other, and then they talk about, culture as values, and they list out their values, and then they worry about kind of why nothing's changing.
Right.
And I was thinking, it does feel like there's a space, because it's actually, if you think about it as people, sometimes we understand the importance of things, but if in the absence of instructions or a map of how to kind of get to somewhere, we end up just staying put in many places, or we end up talking a lot about it, but then actually not doing anything about it.
Absolutely.
So that's really interesting. But before we get into the ideas that you're developing in the book, can you give me your perspective on some of the cultural challenges facing organizations these days? Because you actually, you mentioned that we can attribute or we can blame culture, organizational culture, and more broadly other cultural dimensions for success or failures of different things. So why is culture so important? Is it so important? What are the challenges that organizations are facing regarding kind of culture kind of these days? Just so we can just frame it from a contextual perspective.
Yeah, I think you queued it up perfectly. This whole thing of if we don't understand it, we kind of don't do anything about it.
Right.
So one of the biggest challenges is whether or not an organization does something about the culture, because guess what? It'll exist regardless.
Yes.
Right. And it's a choice about, and I say this to people, you either manage culture or allow that to manage you.
Yes.
And the fact that this whole question of whether or not a company does something about culture, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Culture's everywhere, and it impacts every aspect of the business.
Yes.
So that's why it's so important. And it can be leveraged for an asset, like I said, but oftentimes we don't think about it until we've experienced some sort of failure or, quite frankly, PR disaster.
Yes. Okay.
And that's, again, lost potential there. Even for organizations that somehow managed to create these environments, they sometimes aren't able to sustain them. So that's the other thing about the work that I do, is trying to set the conditions, or at least provide the framework by which a company can sustain and evolve good cultures.
Yeah. Okay. So, you can mention this framework. That's you talked about the framework and you developed it for addressing some of these challenges. But the thing that really struck me about the book and about the framework is that it has design thinking at the heart of it. And I was a bit like, when I saw it, I was like, design thinking and then culture. And then I was like, ooh, that's interesting. Kind of like, it's not necessarily something I've seen applied, design thinking applied to culture before. So can you tell us why you use a design thinking influence approach? Is it that you experienced design thinking in another context and then thought, we could use it over here? Or how did that come about?
Yeah, that did in fact happen. And I talk about that because I have been a student of culture for many years. My undergraduate studies was in culture and ethnic studies. My graduate degree is in organizational psychology. So I did a lot of knowledge gathering over the years between my education and my profession. And I did get exposed to design thinking in a different context and was able to, almost use it as a laboratory, right? Had a few initial projects that tested it out in practice, and there was a light bulb moment, very long light bulb moment, where it was this realization that this is something that has been missing for so long, because there's so much we know about what to do and how to do it in workplaces, and somehow we're not able to implement them, right? And the realization that, first of all, design thinking is by definition interdisciplinary.
Right.
It's extremely democratic in the sense that, or at least it has gotten that way, where people can practice its principles.
Yes.
And learn experientially. And I would say the other influences behind this work includes values-based leadership.
Right.
As well as this concept that's been around for a long time called appreciative inquiry.
Right.
So the combination of those concepts to what I've created here really does address this whole piece about, why is design thinking appropriate? I mean, it's extremely open, and it takes knowledge and makes connections where they don't necessarily exist. And I love that concept. So out of the University of Virginia, the professor there, Judith Litka, probably said it best as to what's appropriate for design thinking. And if you listen to what she says, it almost speaks to why culture should be connected with design thinking. So she talks about this need for a deep understanding of people, to explore and get agreement, and then while having a high degree of uncertainty and having little existing relevant data to begin with. Those 4 conditions.
So does that mean the thing that what's interesting what you're talking about there is you're talking about actually maybe is it that the dominant view of things is that we take quite almost like a scientific management view of things, i.e. kind of like, oh, we need to change this, therefore this is the answer, we should do that, rather than a design thinking approach, which is more of an explorative, almost takes an explorative, investigative, emergent approach to it. So we're going to start, we might not know what the answer is, but we're going to continue exploring until we get agreement around what we think the answer should be that we can go and test, as it were.
Sure. I think it's an and as opposed to an or.
Right.
There are aspects of this work that is quite data-driven and scientific, so to speak.
Okay.
There's an anthropological side of how we look at culture as part of the process as well.
Yes.
And then there's the whole aspect of design, which is, born out of empathy.
Right. Okay.
So it's not an either or, it's more of an and, right?
Okay.
This connective space of how do we clinically look at our contexts, our current conditions, and how do we design for aspirationally?
Okay, brilliant. So
does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, but I think that's why I wanted to sort of dig into it a little bit because it's a really interesting kind of approach. But before we kind of we should stop talking around the subject and rather around the framework and actually talk about the framework. So,
sure.
Can you give it, because that's the heart of the book. So can you give us an overview of the framework and the different elements of it, just to sort of like try and, from an audio perspective, paint a picture, as it were.
So this framework, it's also framework concept methodology, I like to say. It's called Design of Work Experience, or DOWE. And it's a combination of design and change processes enabled by engagement and capability throughout.
Okay.
So those are the 4 major components, and that's at the highest altitude.
Okay.
But they are arranged as a series of 5 phases.
Okay.
And those are understand, create and learn, decide, plan, and implement. And each of those 5 phases have progressive learning loops of specific activities that enable an organization to design, implement, and sustain culture.
And so, I mean, that's because I've got a picture of the framework in front of me.
Right.
And it seems to me, I mean, the things that occur to me is that because you've got, as you say, these learning loops that were in each stage. So, for example, in understand, you've got people and context, insights, criteria, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that you iterate through those things until you get to a point where you feel like you've understood something through all those different sort of loops before you move on to the next stage?
Yeah, I think part of this is understanding that all of this is a learning. Right. And the learning loops are there for several reasons. One is to allow an organization to integrate and iterate. So integrate new knowledge, integrate. That's how we learn, actually.
Yes.
So it's about integrating and learning and going back and relooping again, but progressively so and intentionally.
Okay.
The other piece that the learning loops are there for is to set specific spaces to focus on those activities.
Okay.
We have a tendency in organizations to always be focused on the end or looking ahead.
Uh-huh.
And what we find then is that we're not paying attention to what's in front of us in the present.
Right. Okay.
And sometimes we're caught unawares because of that, right?
Okay.
So this is a form of organizational mindfulness, I like to say.
Okay. So paying attention.
Yes.
Okay. And so when you're going, if you have I guess this is my question around trying to understand how this would work in practice. Like if an organization, say, wanted to go through a bit of a cultural investigation or redesign or, that sort of process. I mean, and do they start with the understand bit and then go through these kind of learning loops? And then how do they know when to transition from one into the other?
So they will see that it will become evident over time. And
Right.
Of course, I write about, what conditions to look for and what actions to satisfy. But I also say that it's not about checking a box and saying, okay, right, I've done steps 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
It's part of it is there's this aspect of intuitiveness that goes into the work.
Okay.
That when you get that depth of understanding, it becomes evident. It's sort of a pass-fail, so to speak.
Right.
So when the framework is done in a way to be able to add some structure to it, but it's also broad enough so that it can be applied to a number of different situations. And in fact, that is the whole concept behind DOWE is you need to customize solutions for the specific context in which it's intended.
Okay. And so does that mean that you could conceivably, if somebody thought the conditions were right in an organization, they could start at the create and learn sort of stage and then realize they didn't actually understand enough and then they'd have to go backwards and then come forward again before they could come forward again?
Yeah, I would change that a little bit in the sense that they should always start at understand. And if
Right.
they've gone through it too quickly and they realize they didn't capture certain aspects, yes, they should be willing to loop back, because if you don't, you go that much farther in the process and realize that you're working with your plate half full, right? You're eating
Right.
with your plate half full, and you're going to have to go back anyway. So being able to understand that earlier in the process means you don't loop back quite as far. Mm-hmm. And that you're continuing to integrate. So I do recommend, I would never say, hey, start at decide.
Yeah.
It's intentionally, the decide phase is intentionally there as the third phase to delay and to get people into that depth of understanding first, because we tend to converge far too quickly. We think we know our culture and we don't understand the complexities behind it.
Well, exactly, Karen. You know kind of what some people are like. They'll go like, "Oh, we know that, and therefore
Exactly.
we'll decide. We'll have a workshop on decide."
Right.
And then it's a train wreck, and then they realize actually we've gone off half cocked, and we need to we need to press the reset button and go right back to the very beginning.
Quite frankly, that's how it happens today, doesn't it?
Completely.
Problem solution. We think we know the problem. We think we know the solution, and that's not always the case.
Absolutely. So, can you give us, maybe tell us a story about how this might work in practice, or how an organization would take this framework and sort of leverage it, just almost, in a sanitized way,
Sure.
to give us some feeling of how this would kind of how it would work in terms of an organization, the component people that be involved, the sort of timeframes, that type of kind of stuff, just to give people some boundaries, as it were, of what a piece of work like this, because it feels quite hefty, might actually feel like.
Yeah, it can get intimidating, and that's why this framework is there to try to break it up into, to your point earlier, digestible pieces.
Yeah.
So if I were to generalize it, there would be kind of two scenarios. One is an organization has an idea of where the challenges are.
Right.
Or the upcoming challenge, to say things are going well even, and how do we sustain it?
Right.
Or they might have an idea of hey, we might have an issue in this space or that space, or we're getting some sense or some results that are demonstrating that there's some sort of illness in the organization or a lost potential. So this whole concept that people talk about toxic culture, and it's sad that there's a term out there around that.
Yes, indeed.
So sometimes they might know there's something wrong, and they say, okay, let's take a look at this methodology and help us dive into it and figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do something about it, right? So there's that piece. The other piece might be, we don't know, and we need to explore that. That's what that understand phase is all about, because that begins with a culture study that will identify the most salient themes in an organization and the complexities behind that.
Right. And does that include sort of like both written and unwritten rules in many ways?
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with looking at different data points, using different methodologies to get that. So it's not just what's said, but it's also what's lived and what's observed.
Yes.
And those pieces need to be integrated because they sometimes conflict with one another. So it's a way of reconciling all those different data points to get a clearer picture of what's going on. Okay. And those might identify where the opportunity spaces are and where the efforts should be around the design problem.
Okay.
And I don't like saying problem because oftentimes it's about framing it more positively. So rather than addressing problems, how do we set the conditions where those problems can exist? That's where the appreciative inquiry comes in.
Yes. Okay. And then once they've done the culture study, then what would happen?
So then they get into the actual design work. So when you do the culture study, you build insights from that, and designers should be quite familiar with that concept, and using that to establish criteria, which becomes the decision-making tool later on in the process. Those are the not nice to haves, but the absolute need to haves for both the organization and the people working there.
Right.
And having those in their understand phase allows them to create, brainstorm, and play with ideas and strategies that will help them create and learn this, whatever they're going to be working on.
Yeah. And when you kind of say designers and things, designers respond to, are familiar with insights and things, you're using the term quite broadly in terms of designers. It's not necessarily, this could be anybody from organizational designers, work designers. It could be even creative designers as well. I mean, because I think it's important to kind of to point out that everybody is a designer in this process, I guess.
Yes, yeah. And this whole insights of what is the essence of what's going on? Yeah. What's the learning? How would we articulate the learning, and how does that reframe our understanding?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Those can be quite profound. Yes.
And then what kind of once you've done that, you've designed that you've gone to that sort of you take the insights and you started to design things. Is it what happens then? Is it then like in a normal sort of design thinking approach to say of new products and services or innovation or whatever? Is it that you actually take sort of pilots or prototypes and then go test them?
Yeah, there's the opportunity to prototype as a form of helping, and that's part of the decide phase actually, to prototype. Once you've explored the ideas thoroughly enough, then you're able to prototype them and see how they work. And the way Tim Brown says it in Change by Design is, rather than making it one large decision, because you're iterating, you're making a lot of smaller decisions along the way, and it's actually less risky that way.
And when you say kind of prototype, I mean, is that you end up prototyping with teams or little departments, or it could be just kind of initiatives, or how do you test those sort of things? Because actually, when you're thinking about culture and people, actually turning people into lab rats in many ways, that could be equally disruptive.
Yeah, and I would say there's different ways to approach prototype. But I think the important piece of it is that it is in real life.
Right.
So there's an understanding of how that's going to play out in real life. Now, one can argue that what we live right now is one large experiment, is it not?
Yeah, well, that's true, depending on your kind of like how much altitude you've got.
Yeah. So So this intent of this work is really to make what is maybe a good experience extraordinary.
Right.
And it needs to have a certain degree of innovation and disruptiveness to make a difference. It has to be noticeable enough.
Right. Okay.
To be able to make a tangible impact. So yeah, there's different ways to prototype. I don't want to prescribe that because again, it's context based. But
Sure.
the important aspect of prototype is that you get an understanding of how it's going to happen in real life.
Mm-hmm. And also, I guess, kind of how you're going to measure success and whether something works or not.
Yeah, but it allows you to tinker with it, right? And I try to avoid saying, okay, that means a program, because it might not be that.
Yes.
It might not be programmatic. It might not be initiative driven. And so however that ends up being, an understanding of how that's going to look like, should it be rolled out completely? Yes. That's helping us learn along the way.
And I guess it also allows us to explore what is the dominant logic within organizations, because most organizations tend to have them. For example, if somebody talks about a big challenge for many organizations right now is siloed thinking and lack of cross-functional working and collaboration, or lack of effective and efficient cross-functional working. And one of the top suggestions to combat that is people go, oh, we should have a software platform to enable more communication. You're like going, but if you haven't set the conditions for people to want to talk, why would people want to talk on this software platform? Yeah. If you know what I mean.
I totally know what you mean, because I tell a story about how a company decided to invest millions of dollars in a new system because they couldn't talk to people about doing their time cards accurately.
Right.
It's very expensive. But it's the same thing. It's not technology for technology's sake.
Yes.
It's using technology to make work easier, more efficient, right? And allows us to be able to work on higher order tasks, right?
And so the technology becomes
an enabler.
Or like it, even I think possibly more than that, it becomes the right tool for the right job, but it doesn't necessarily have to be technology led. Right.
Okay. You say that very eloquently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if we go, and then beyond the decide, and once you've kind of landed on things, then I guess it's the framework talks about planning and that sort of road mapping, a rollout, and then implementing and kind of and then tinkering along the way to sort of you get to the point where you optimize the new culture framework to lead to the sort of the results that you want. But I guess that leads me nicely onto this idea that, well, what sort of outcomes can organizations expect to see as a result of going through this kind of process? Because it feels like quite a heavy process, but it feels like also you're investing your effort up front for the right sort of returns. It's not necessarily a quick fix.
No, and this is meant to add some structure to it. Culture is complex. Yes. People are complex, right? Yeah. So there's no way to oversimplify it without losing efficacy, let's just say. So yeah, it can be intimidating to people. That's a mental block, though. I see it. Right. Because this is full of possibilities for those that are open to it. And go back to all the companies that made the headlines and ask them if they would do it differently.
Yeah.
Would they be willing to do something like this up front to prevent what they're dealing with now? I think the answer would be yes. So I think that intimidation factor does creep up from time to time as you work through this process. But I provide some tools to help people work through it. That's the whole part of why we work alongside and collaborate with other people. It's part of it is supporting each other through a process. And this whole reason why we need to pair the design piece with change management. Right. Because you can have a great design if you don't change management, if you don't implement it well, then you've kind of weakened its strength. Right? Sure. And you can't change things without a really strong design. Yes. So there's a lot of interdependencies here. And so that's why there's a handoff during the planning process between the design part of the process and the change part of the process.
Okay. But it also kind of feels like there's, surely there must be some positive, if you like, employee engagement outcomes from this because of the design thinking approach, because it's multidisciplinary. You're getting lots more people involved in the process. So rather,
that's right.
If it's a cultural redesign, which then follows in, and part of that then becomes there's an org redesign part of it with more people involved, then that should actually lead to like a higher levels of engagement and things, and then all the kind of positive stuff that comes from that. Is that right?
Yeah, and this whole aspect of engaging the whole of the community and leveraging the talent of it, right? So what we have in organizations today are these top-down edicts that get pushed to the rest of the organization, and oftentimes not well. This whole co-design aspect where you work with the people that are expected to adopt those changes and give them the empowerment to create that future together increases engagement for sure. And it also creates connections where they didn't exist before. So this whole huge chasm between the top and everyone else.
Yes.
That gets bridged through something like this, right? You have all the talent in an organization, and you're able to leverage that, right? Because think about how many poor decisions were made. I had a conversation the other day about PepsiCo's commercial that went sideways, and PepsiCo being such a large organization, there absolutely would have been somebody in there somewhere that may have had knowledge or understanding or perspective that maybe should have been incorporated.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the, Karen, I hope that we've actually given listeners and readers sort of a flavor of the framework and the work that you've done. I mean, there's so much more in the book that we can't cover all, or we'd be here for hours.
That's true. We could talk all day about this.
Exactly. But hopefully, our conversation is giving people a flavour of the framework, and actually just the really, which I think is right at the heart of it, the fusing of a design thinking approach to creating a cultural context or environment which allows good things to happen.
Yeah, there's this aspect of why frame things as experiences. That's how we organize our memories. That's how we're coded. And so to be able to frame them as experiences, the fact that we are learning creatures, that's why we need to learn through this culture work.
Yeah.
There's so many aspects of what we are that haven't been incorporated before. And that's really an intent of this work. It's not the framework or the tool itself. It's really, does this improve people's experiences at work? Does this change cultures? How is this lived? So I don't want people to feel like, they're only focusing on the tool itself. That's there to help them create these experiences that are meant to be extraordinary, differentiating, custom made for the context, because there's so much of this aspect where all these companies take what's these so-called best practices and implement them wholesale without an understanding of how they're going to play out in their context.
Sure.
That creates, quite frankly, more problems than it solves.
Yeah.
And so that's really the intent of this work. That's what I want to make sure people understand. It's not, okay, what's that step again? And where are we in the process? Yeah, there's guidance around that. But what are we actually doing? We're creating this culture, and we're helping to set the conditions for both the business and its people to thrive.
Perfect. So with that in mind, I mean, if I was to say to you, Karen, that people say there's executives, entrepreneurs, leaders listening to this interview or reading the highlights, and they're thinking about some of their own company's culture, and some of the challenges that they may be facing, or some of the issues that they're spotting. I mean, what sort of advice would you give them in terms of where to start in trying to tackle some of those? I mean, apart from hiring you and apart from buying your book, I mean, at a distance, very general advice. I mean, what would you say to them? What should they be doing first? What should they focusing on first?
Well, if it's a decision maker in an organization, I think they need to first work on themselves to create an openness to do things, do things differently. So if you want different results, you need to be willing to do different things.
Right.
And that might mean being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the growth aspect of it. But being able to appreciate and being open to the possibilities of creating something. I mean, this is there's only so much you can read about.
Mm-hmm.
It's really meant to be experientially learned.
Mm-hmm.
So a leader, I would advise for them is really self-examine your mental models and your mental blocks and be able to address that up front.
Yeah.
Because this is going to be different. And that was part of the pitch I had to make for the book with publishers is this is not your typical business book.
Yeah.
And saying it up front. So my advice is the leaders, that change begins, and by the way, change begins when the questions become being asked, right? So it's not just that we have to do something. It's your world. That's one of my favorite quotes. Our worlds are formed by the questions we ask.
Yes.
And the minute we start questioning, I think that's when things start. So I that's my best advice is to open themselves up to new possibilities, because when you've gotten to that senior level, you think you know everything.
Well, sure. Brilliant. Thanks, Karen. So before I get on to my final question, is there anything else that you'd like to add that you think that we've missed out before I get to this last question?
I think I got most of the foundational aspects in, but I certainly am open to people reaching out to me and asking me any follow-up questions. I love the interaction with people. And all of this I see this as a collaboration of sorts, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to understand cultures better and be able to leverage them.
Perfect.
And so this is all part of our learning.
Super. Well, I'll make sure when I do write up all the highlights and things, is I'll make sure I put details of how to get in touch with you in terms of your website and kind of LinkedIn and all that type of stuff on there, so people can get in touch with you. So that brings me to my final question, Karen, that I always ask at the end of these interviews. And the question is this: is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
I'm not the best self-promoter, so I'll do what I typically do. I'd like to plug the people of your organization. Okay?
Okay.
I feel that, your business exists and is successful because of your people. Mm-hmm. And so investing in them should be a top priority. And it's not just an investment. People tend to think short term when it comes to business, and the companies that do best have this long-term view. Mm-hmm. But you'll see through the practice of this work is that there are immediate returns with it. And so my shameless plug is to turn that lens inward and to help organizations really become more employee-focused, people-centered.
Perfect. Well, given that you haven't plugged yourself, but you've plugged everybody else, I will plug you and say
Thank you.
You should look up Karen Jaw-Madson and you should check out our book, Culture Your Culture, Innovating Experiences at Work, because it's a tool and it's also a toolbox, and it's an innovative approach to a perennial problem. And I think it's really interesting. I think it's a really solid and useful piece of work. So congratulations on that. People, you should definitely check it out. But Karen, thank you for making the time to share some thoughts with us today, to explain to us a little bit about the book. That's been brilliant.
Oh, thank you. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Well, that's it for another interview. I really hope you enjoyed it. Now, every time I complete one of these interviews, I learn something new, and I try and incorporate that new learning into my writing, my speaking, my workshops, and the consulting that I do for my clients. If you're interested, you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinsco.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do listen in again. All the very best.